Good evening. I am the Reverend Dr. Stephanie May and a member of the steering committee of Metro West Climate Solutions and minister at First Parish in Wayland. Metro West Climate Solutions, or MCS, is a partnership of congregations and organizations in the Metro West area, including First Parish Church in Weston, First Parish in Wayland, First Parish in Lincoln, Sustainable Weston Action Group, and a growing list of organizations and individuals. Our mission is to foster sustainable, resilient, and low-carbon communities and to host timely and relevant programs that encourage people and organizations to get involved in bringing about solutions to some of the great challenges of our time. While the challenges are immense and global, the solutions are mainly local and certainly involve all of us who reside here in industrialized countries, making different choices regarding our food, transportation, and energy use. All of us have a role to play in moving our society and economy towards a low or no carbon future. You can learn more about Metro West Climate Solutions at metrowestclimatesolutions.org, where you can also see recordings of some of our prior sessions or on our YouTube channel. And when you go to the metrowestclimatesolutions.org, you can also see information about our next event on May 2nd with the Reverend Mariama White Hammond on the topic of environmental justice. Tonight, we are here to ask, what's dinner got to do with it? As we explore food, farming, and climate change. The food we eat, where we buy it, and how that food is grown affects our health and that of the planet. Approximately 1/3 of total human-made greenhouse gas emissions are linked to our food system. And it was some information about that inspired the steering committee to reach out to our panelists tonight to tell us more, to help us understand this important aspect of lowering our carbon footprint. Our first presenter will be Erin Coughlin de Perez. She is an associate professor at Tufts and technical advisor to the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center. She bridges science, policy, and practice in her research on climate risk management around the world. She focuses on extreme events, exploring how droughts, floods, heat waves, and other climate shocks can be anticipated before they happen. Next, we'll hear from Jennifer Hashley, the director of the New Entry Sustainable Farming Project at Tufts. Jennifer is a leader in local food systems work, focusing on beginning farmer development. Her role includes building community partnerships, securing sustainable resources for all program operations, and overseeing program development for a multi-year sustainable agricultural training program for limited resource beginning farmers. And finally, we will hear from Winton Pitkoff. Winton is joining us a little bit later because Winton is receiving an award right now. Winton is the executive director of the Massachusetts Food System Collaborative, where he leads an effort to support collective action toward an equitable, sustainable, resilient, and connected local food system in Massachusetts. MFSC works to facilitate implementation of the Massachusetts Local Food Action Plan by building the capacity of food system stakeholders to engage in policy advocacy. As you listen tonight, we ask that you use the Q&A feature down at the bottom of your screen for asking your questions. It's just a little easier to organize a flow of questions if you can do that. And now we will hear from our first panelist, Erin. Thank you, Erin.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone. It's great to be here with all of you tonight, and I look forward to the discussion and questions afterwards. So what I'd like to do to set the stage for our wider discussion tonight is talk a little bit about extreme events. My work is generally focused on extremes and disasters. I have this background in the humanitarian sector working with the Red Cross, and I'm a climate scientist by training. So for the last few years, I was working on the IPCC report, sort of putting together the answer to the big global question. What is happening to our climate? Why is it happening? And what can we do about it? And a lot of my work is on looking at extremes. And one of the things that we found is that climate change isn't a thing of the future, right? I think sometimes we talk about it as if climate change is something that will affect us in 2100 or become um, visible in 50 to 100 years. And that's really not true. We are able to, this is a map of the world, if you can't tell. The hexagons represent different regions of the world. And these are places everywhere, in orange or that sort of brownish, reddish color, are places where we are already very confident that we've seen an increase in hot extremes. In green, we see here places that we've also seen an increase in heavy precipitation events. And here are places where we have already seen an increase in drought. So climate change is already here. And in most of the world, there are discernible impacts that people are already dealing with. I'm sure you can think about your own lives and what you've seen and what you can observe that's different now than it might have been maybe when you were a child or 50 years ago. So what does that mean? And why is this a problem? My argument today, the idea that I want to present is that small, slow changes in climate are interesting and they're relevant, but that in fact, extreme events, right? Extreme heat, extreme drought are really the ways that these are going to manifest and cause major problems around the world, including for agriculture. I'd love for you to think just for a second, I'll pause for a second, about an example of an extreme weather event that either you've heard about on the news or you've lived through and experienced in your own life, and how that might have changed policy and practice in your area. I won't ask you to say it, obviously that you can't be that interactive, but I'll pause for a second to make sure everyone has an example. And what I find with this exercise, if we get to discuss your examples, are that society is really shaped by our experience of extremes. When Hurricane Sandy hit New York, it fundamentally changed the decisions that New York City decided to make about protecting itself from climate change and building seawalls and resilient infrastructure, right? Even though we knew climate was changing around us, people are very motivated after they've experienced something super memorable to then make changes. So you can imagine why that's a problem. If we are motivated to change our behavior after we get hit by a disaster, that is a bad message for humanity that we have to sit around and wait for disasters and then decide we're going to do something to protect society. So some of my research is about how can we imagine unprecedented disasters and extreme events before they happen. So I'm going to talk you through an example of a paper that we worked on recently looking at wheat in the Midwest. So this is mostly focused on sort of the region around Kansas that grows winter wheat and produces a large portion of the US winter wheat crop. So in this region, we said, okay, well, people make decisions based on their past experiences. They know what die they're rolling based on what's happened to them in the past. In the past, this could have happened, this could have happened, this could have happened, and you have a sense. On my die, there's a 1, on my die, there's a 6. I might be rolling some 3s and 4s, but I know the 6 is possible. But the big question for us is, we are now rolling different die, right? Climate change has fundamentally changed the die that we're rolling. So in this region, here's an example of what people might have experienced in the past. The little blue X's, and I'm realizing the vertical axis is temperature in Celsius. So sorry, because this is so 35 to 40 degrees Celsius is very hot. These are maximum temperatures in the March, April, May season that is critical for the growth of winter wheat. So this is the maximum temperature that we observed every year in that season. And for reference, between 35 and 40 is really hot, like 100 degrees is in there for Fahrenheit. So this is what people think they're rolling, right? This is what we've experienced over time. And so some of my research is saying, well, let's use climate model to simulate 1981 over and over and over again and say, well, what could have happened in 1981? And do it again for all these different years to create some alternative realities of Earth. What could have happened? What was on the die that we rolled in 1981? And what was on the die that we rolled in 2020? So here's what we found. This is a box plot showing here are all the temperatures that we got when we ran our model hundreds of times for 1980, for 1981, 1982, et cetera, et cetera. And you'll see that there's a pretty definitive trend here, and that our model produced some high temperatures that were much, much higher than anything that had been experienced before. And in fact, recent experience, sort of these recent blue crosses, are not on the high end of the spectrum. They're not on the high end of the die roll. So there might be an 8 on this die that people have never seen before and might not be prepared for. So we did this. This is maximum temperature in the growing season. We did this again for a couple other variables that were important for wheat, including drought and things like this, to start talking about unprecedented extremes and talking about what kind of preparedness would we need to do to prepare for this kind of thing. And so you can imagine this is a plot just showing how frequently certain events would happen. So something that would happen once in every 100 years was maybe a temperature of 35 degrees, right? According to, this is the observational record. And this is in 1981. According to the observational record, our best estimate of something that might have happened once in 100 years is now a lot warmer. And if you add in those many, many, many runs of alternative realities of our climate, we get much more constrained, precise estimates of our current risk. So then the ultimate message of this plot is to say, look, in 1981, the 1 in 100-year event, hottest temperatures that you would expect to happen every 100 years are actually temperatures that now happen on average every 6 years. That's what this corresponds to at the bottom here. So we've been starting to able to quantify that every year you have a remarkably high probability of a record-breaking heat event in this region because we're rolling new die. And so can we use this information and these scenarios of unprecedented extremes to motivate people to make changes in how they're doing agriculture and how they're planning and protecting their work or their livelihoods in a changed climate? So what was also interesting is our use of these big climate models can also help us understand what kind of weather conditions would produce these unprecedented extremes. And so these are weather maps showing, changes in atmospheric pressure, and the arrows are winds. So you can see here for some of these really low, really dry, unprecedented drought events, we're seeing winds that are coming from the Rockies and bringing dry air over this region, whereas unprecedented, very, very wet flooding events are seeing winds that are bringing wet air from the Gulf of Mexico. So not that this is the particulars of this case might not be relevant in New England, but the overall methods of being able to say, what does a changed climate look like? What are some stories that we can tell of unprecedented heat, unprecedented drought, and the conditions that produce those, so that we can start to better prepare for these kinds of events in society? So what we're doing in a number of places across the country is collaborating with the American Red Cross. So we're working on what they're calling their community adaptation program. And basically the Red Cross is saying, we respond to disasters. And if disasters are going to become more frequent and more intense and look fundamentally different from what they looked like in the past, then we might need to prepare differently. And what could that look like? So we're working with them in a number of pilot locations across the country to do some workshops and say, here is a scenario of an event that is now possible because our climate has changed. How can we prepare for that? Who might be vulnerable? And what might we want to do to put policies in place and plans in place so that we're ready when these kinds of events happen? So with that, hopefully I've helped expand your imagination a little bit about how, I guess my thesis would be we need bigger imaginations when it comes to climate change. So I'd love to turn over to Jennifer, and she can take us through a bit more detail about our region here in Massachusetts. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Erin. I just learned a lot about the work that you're doing. This is great. So I will share my screen and get the slide going. All right. So I just wanted to start out a little bit talking about climate smart agriculture, which seems to be the term of the day in our world. And just to kind of frame it a little bit, I think sometimes it's helpful to have a little bit of definitions to learn about, to talk about what do we mean by climate smart ag? What do we mean by sustainability? And so I think a lot of people are putting their faith in agriculture, that because it has such an impact on climate, that we're also going to be a huge part of the solution moving forward. So I just want to stress through these first few slides about definitions. A lot of people define sustainability as the intersection between, the three-legged stool of people, profit, and the planet part of that. And when all of these things are well aligned, hopefully, things are in balance and moving forward well. Other different kinds of models. I was just talking earlier to some of the other folks. I love this book by called Donut Economics by Kate Raworth. She has some YouTube videos out there. You can learn more about her model of thinking about how we operate in this way with this kind of sustainable needs of all of our basic social foundation for food, water, housing, health, energy, all of that. There's the space where we can do this in a regenerative and distributive economy. And when we surpass this ecological ceiling, we start to see that ecological space kind of break down with climate change, acidification, and all these other types of risks. So that might be a thing to think about in sustainability. I'm also thinking about what is the food system. We're talking about what's for dinner tonight. Some people talk about this food system, and sometimes that term can be a little bit confusing. I think some of these models are helpful to show the different interdynamics between production, consumption, waste recycling, supply, demand, policies that influence all of these things. On the left is a newer model that I hadn't seen until recently, where really thinking about the food system centering land as the center of the food system. And if we can build all of our production practices and care and stewardship on the land as the center, and then build the systems around that, people on the outside, maybe we'll have a different perspective of how we think about sustainability in the food system. And there's just lots of links. A lot of people also talk about this food supply chain. We heard a lot about that during the pandemic, how it broke down. There's also just again, to point out all these different actors along the supply chain that influence things that happen on the ground in our policies with the land and in the media, everything else related to the systems that we're working with. And then other people use terms like our food shed. What is our food shed? What is local? I like the map on the right, thinking about our Greater Boston regional food shed. It's important to note that like half of our food shed is the ocean. So a lot of times food systems don't include fisheries in the conversation, and thinking about what impacts there are to climate change and fisheries as well. So when we talk about our local food system, we also have to think about, well, how far does that extend? 25 miles, 200 miles. Some people define local as 400 miles. So we can quickly surpass, New England when we're talking about what our local food shed is or our local food system. So I think one thing to be clear about too is we have a lot of concentration in the food system when we're talking about, who's impacting the climate and agriculture. How is agriculture having this outsized impact? Thinking about how we've moved over the many decades toward increasing consolidation and monopolistic farming operations. And that's been happening across the ag sector and crop and seed biotechnology and the chemical industry, machinery, animal health. We have the top 4 firms in each of these sectors. And I don't know if you've all seen this. Dr. Howard from Michigan State has a lot of really great concentration in the food sector graphics that really show how this is playing out in the different sectors here. And so what that means, and why I'm kind of talking about this, is it really decreases the farmer's share of our food dollar, and fewer and fewer pennies are going to the farmer who is growing the food and who may or may not have the ability to implement new practices to change the way that they farm, because there's just not a lot of margin in the returns that they're getting for the work that they're doing on the land. And we've seen as that's happened, as farmers are getting fewer and fewer dollars, it means that they have to generate more income from off the farm. So we've now got the situation where more and more people, more than 80% of farmers have to have off-farm jobs just to survive and pay their household bills. And so that's creating challenges of keeping people on the land to steward the land and to steward this next generation of farmers that we want to care for the land and to help solve this climate crisis. So, we have a lot of aging farmers in this part of the country, and a lot of these farmers don't have identified successors that are young or taking over the farm. There's a lot of land that's going to change hands. And if we want to continue that in food production, we need people that are well trained to steward the soil and grow these businesses. One of the other things related to farming that's challenging is getting access to land. And this is especially true for the beginning farmers that we work with, especially in the Metro Boston area. You can imagine land is very scarce. It's not always available, affordable, accessible. And when farmers get access to it, it may not be through secure arrangements. And as we're seeing increasing variability, it's really helpful if you're a farmer with multiple parcels of land where you can potentially manage your climate risk. If you have a very well-drained sandy soil in a year where there's a lot of moisture, maybe you'll still be able to get crops. In really dry years, if you have soil that holds moisture better, you will still get crops in those fields. So being able to kind of mitigate where you plant and how you can farm is great if we're talking about extreme weather events like Erin was just mentioning. Maybe it doesn't matter if you have multiple fields with different soil types, you're still in trouble. So coupled with all of these consolidation, we see a lot of consumer demand for local food, which is really great, which is driving people to change their eating habits. And certainly during the pandemic, people were excited to see that local farms were able to provide our food. We've seen a lot of marketing, know your farmer, know your food. And in this area, we have a lot of farms selling direct to consumers, which is great. The northeastern part of the country really has the largest share of direct to consumer sales, and the top four of the top 10 states are here in the Northeast region. So we are fortunate that for the food that we eat, we have a lot of access to direct to farm producers. Yet we're still not very self-sufficient when we look at how much we consume in this region and how much we're actually producing. So if folks have looked at kind of the 50 by 60 vision, calls for growing 50% of our food by 2060, yet we are not really there yet producing that amount of food that we consume. We may produce about half our dairy, about a third of our vegetables, most of which is potatoes from Maine, 10% of our fruit, but less than 1% of our grains and animal protein in this region. So we have a way to go to think about, if we are disrupted in the future through climate impacts and disasters, how well are we doing, self-sufficiently here in New England? And as we said, climate change is a challenge. As Erin mentioned, seeing the increased severity and frequency of these extreme weather events, which have really strong impacts on our soil, nutrient holding capacity, and crop yields and costs for farmers. So, it can certainly, climate change slows productivity, it reduces crop yields, there, altered production timelines. We're seeing, lack of winter chill, harvest dates are getting either shorter or longer, delayed plantings. If there's too much water, we see new kinds of pests, weeds, and diseases that are persisting as they're expanding their range, moving further north or otherwise. And, farmers are being asked to invest in new practices, trying new crop varieties, finding other management practices, and all those things. If you can't get equipment in the field, you may have to send a labor crew in and to manually weed or other things that cost more labor and more investment for your farm business. And it has an impact on the nutritional availability of the food. Basically, increased carbon dioxide concentrations have been shown to reduce levels of iron, protein, zinc, and other types of nutrients in our forage qualities. Increased heat and drought can impact, like I said, the fertility that's held in the soil. If soil is eroding or nutrients are being lost, organic matter is being lost, it's, the soil's not holding enough carbon, that can have an impact on fertility and crop yields and production. And obviously thinking about the workers, the people who are in the field growing our food, if they're having, to work outside in extreme heat and weather, it becomes more challenging, they're less productive, it costs more for the farmer to protect their workers. And this all puts a lot of pressure on the land, really thinking about how we protect our natural resources in the process. Talking about livestock, it has, extreme weather events, heat stress in livestock, it really affects their reproductive capacity and their health. When you're caring for livestock, they're sentient beings. Farmers also get stressed out and depressed themselves, but, and thinking about all of these impacts really increase and risk the, creates more threats to livelihoods and our food security. So thinking about what are these climate smart agriculture practices that farmers are doing, I think, trying to define what even is climate smart agriculture. And there are a few definitions out there, one of which is basically just saying it's an integrated approach to managing the landscape, crops, livestock, forage, that address all these interlinked challenges of how do we maintain food security in this space of accelerating climate change. So people are trying to work on adaptation approaches, mitigation approaches, thinking about trade-offs to achieve goals, and then thinking about what people can do specifically on their farms and their sites. So USDA has many examples of what these climate smart practices might be that people are already trying to integrate on the ground on their farms, obviously paying attention to soil health, keeping the soil covered so it's less prone to erosion through cover cropping, not tilling the land, keeping that organic matter in the soil, filter strips, buffer strips, managing nutrients, applying fertilizers efficiently, buffers, forestation projects, agroforestry, all kinds of things that people are trying to figure this out. And then thinking about, well, how do we incentivize farmers to do this? If we think agriculture is going to be this part of the solution to climate change, we have to make sure that farmers have economically viable businesses and are supported to try these practices and manage risks, and thinking about the policies that are in place to support that. So FAO has some recommendations for incentivizing climate smart agriculture by expanding the evidence base and figuring out what works and what's effective. And then we have to put in the policy frameworks to also support that and make sure that there's collaboration between our institutions, that there's funding and financing available, and that farmers can actually put these practices in place at the ground level. So just a couple quick things about what's happening here. And I know Winton's going to get more detail at the local level, but USDA basically has programs and policies that do support conservation, but it's really, in my view, not enough at this stage. Between the last few years, between 2017 and 2020, EQIP, which is the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, which is the one program that really supports stewardship and climate smart agriculture practices, only 23% of those payments went to these practices. And it's been, even the conservation stewardship program, basically they found that less than 0.3% of these practices were considered to mitigate climate change. So the policies and the funding we have in place to incentivize farmers is still not being, thoroughly leveraged and vetted to these kinds of practices. With the Inflation Reduction Act, there is a lot more money on the table, another $20 billion in new conservation funding to support climate smart agriculture, which is great. And then there's going to be another $40 billion in here for existing USDA programs, another 20 in total for $40 billion to really try to get more of this money out on the ground for support to help producers with cost share investments, with technical assistance, and other programming to get them to put these practices into place. And at our state level, our Department of Ag has a Climate Smart Ag program that helps fund some cost share programs to get farmers on the ground here. But they must be engaged in agriculture, and they have to have property that has been in use at least for the prior 3 years. So this does limit how we can support beginning farmers with these kinds of practices. And I will just close by giving you a very brief, because I'm running out of time, overview of New Entry and what we're doing with beginning farmers around this work. Our goal really is to get more folks into the business of farming so that we can steward the land and that folks can practice these kind of climate smart practices here locally and sustain our local and regional food system. And we do this through 3 areas: through our farmer training programs, our food hub, and our national capacity building work. By taking farmers who decide they want to farm through business planning, giving them access to the land and training on our incubator farm, and then hopefully helping them transition off to their own farm eventually in the region. We teach a crop production course, and I wanted to mention it because our registration is open now and the class starts on Tuesday night, April 18th. So if you're interested, it's online for 8 weeks. You can learn all about growing crops here in New England. So I encourage you to check that out. And then we do our business planning course in the fall and the winter. And once folks take a business planning course, you can take a little virtual tour on our website, on our YouTube channel. They can access land at our incubator farm for up to 3 years. We do on-farm soil health and climate smart demonstrations in our demonstration plots, so the farmers that are here can learn different practices that they can be using as they're getting started and as they transition to their own farm. We do this in partnership with lots of folks across the state. And we also help sell the food to local consumers through different market channels, our CSA and food access programs. And lots of partners there. We also help, we run a field network nationally of other land-based training programs. And over time, we've trained a lot of farmers and helped get a lot of food in the local economy to make sure that we can all continue to eat. So I just sum up to say what works. I think lots of intergenerational farmer to farmer sharing and knowledge and peer sharing, and making sure that folks are supporting our local farmers so that they can run economically viable businesses. And we try to provide that safe space for them to learn and grow over time. And our goals moving forward are to help get more farmers on the land and to continue to advocate for consumers to value the local food system. And what you can do, hopefully you're already buying and eating locally, maybe plant a garden, get involved in change making, help keep farmland in your communities open, support us, volunteer, buy a license plate to support our work. And thank you, and I look forward to questions. So turn it over to Winton to tell us what we're doing at the local level.
Thank you, Jennifer, and good evening, everybody. And as I work to share my screen, I'm going to point out what will become obvious to all of you very quickly. Going to go over some of the same ground that Jennifer and Aaron already went over to prove that we didn't rehearse, and also because it's the truth. And it's all with the idea of making the case for some policy opportunities that I'll talk about towards the end. So to start out, and this is a lot of what you've heard already, the threats are pretty obvious at this point. The weather is the one that we know the most. We've talked about heat, talked about cold. We're not going to have peaches in Massachusetts this year because of that cold snap that we had where the temperature got below 10 below. And so that inconsistency makes it very hard to plan. And obviously the floods and the droughts make have a significant impact on productive capacity of the land. The changing climate and the changing weather has changed the patterns of invasive species, both flora and fauna. And so we're seeing new invasive bugs that we don't know how to deal with that are causing problems with crops, and also lots of new weeds that previously our landscape was not hospitable to them, and now it is. And so it's all kinds of new challenges for farmers from bugs and plants. Jen talked about soil degradation better than I can, so I'll just mention that in passing. And all of this leads to the overall loss of production. Jen also mentioned the threat to workers, the idea of working out in the heat. We're already seeing significant impacts of that, particularly in the Southwest and Southern California, where so much of our food comes from. Sea level rise is causing saltwater intrusion into water tables in coastal areas where there's significant amounts of farming, and that's spoiling the water, making it not good for agriculture, not good for anything. And then sea level rise also means not necessarily about the farms that are there in the coastal areas, but people are going to have to move. And folks who live along the coast are going to be looking for new places to live further inland. And that's going to put much more pressure on existing farmland to turn it into housing. So those are some of the basic threats, and you heard about more already. And I just want to add that when we talk about this stuff, this is not what we're seeing happening in the future and what we're concerned about happening. Every single one of those things that we just talked about, we're seeing evidence of that already. This is not about the future. This is about now. And just to go back, that picture's from a farm just up the road in Lancaster, that because of the terrain there, it floods like that frequently because of its proximity to the river. So in terms of opportunities and what farmers can actually bring to the table when it comes to issues around climate, farmers they're partners, they have assets, and their primary assets are land and the management practices they use to cultivate that land. So obviously they can sequester carbon, and they do that certainly through perennial crops, which is one of the best ways. Annual crops sequester carbon as well, and then farmers that plant cover crops are doing double duty by in the off season sequestering carbon that way as well. Farmers, as I mentioned, have a lot of land. We don't want to lose farmland to solar production. It's very appealing to solar developers. when they see a nice big open field, particularly near high tension lines, that they think that's a nice easy place to put up solar panels. But farmers also own a lot of non-productive land, whether it's hilly or rocky, and farmers should be able to benefit from the use of that land by putting in solar panels that will actually ultimately help the state meet its climate goals. Sustainable farms are obviously able to protect their land better from development, because it's not just solar developers that are eyeing those nice big flat parcels. It's also developers of housing and of commercial and industry. Farms and the management practices they use play a big role in water retention and filtration, and a lot of other natural resource protection issues, whether it's the windbreaks from farmers who take care of their forested areas as well, wildlife habitat, wildlife pass-throughs. Farmers have a big role to play in helping the state actually address its climate change concerns. So I don't want to just paint the farmers as victims here, although they're certainly struggling, and that's definitely the primary story here tonight. But the reality is they also need to be a partner at the table when we think about how are we going to solve all these problems. And so what's needed? So why do farmers need help doing this? So Jennifer had some numbers. Another one is that just in Massachusetts, for every dollar farmers spend producing food, they earn 94 cents. I'm not making that up. We're only one of 4 states where that number is turned on its head, where farmers earn less than it costs them to produce food. And so the idea of saying to them, well, you need to employ better management practices, different management practices, you need to change what you're doing, needs to be coupled with, we need to support farmers in doing this and in being that kind of partner around climate change. And so the needs are pretty straightforward. We need more research, and we heard some of that also from Erin. We need to be studying what's happening and as a way of helping farmers prepare. Farmers can't pivot on a dime. And as the climate changes, farmers need to be thinking about what crops will grow well in a changing climate, how to better address invasives. So we need to be investing in research. And I'll point out that UMass Extension, which is one of the best sources of objective science-based research in Massachusetts, currently has a budget and a staff capacity of about 1/3 of what it was 25 years ago. We did this past year get some new money for Extension, the first time Extension got new money in decades. But if we continue disinvesting in that resource, farmers are really going to be stuck. Education as well. The research is only as good as the folks who are able to then translate that into some practical knowledge for farmers. So education and technical support are essential to helping farmers, whether it's classroom type stuff or whether it's field work and actually going out to farms and helping them understand how their soil is changing and how their management practices need to change and how the growing season is changing, how to work with climate controlled growing, hoop houses, greenhouses, as farmers become more and more reliant on them as a way of stabilizing the growing season. And then policy changes and public investments, all to help flatten that or balance that equation that I talked about how unsustainable farming can be in Massachusetts. So the state has done quite a bit of work around climate change, and I'll cite a couple of the reports here. The first was a climate assessment that came out towards the end of 2022. It gave pretty short shrift to agriculture, quite honestly. The focus around agriculture was about the economic impact. They talked about the challenges of working in the heat. They talked about the loss of fresh water and what that's going to mean to agriculture. They touched briefly on the cultural impact of losing local farms. But they didn't talk about food security. And what we saw, particularly early in the pandemic, is that when global and national food supply chains break down, we start to rely on our local farms pretty significantly, and they step up. And so if we're going to be talking about what the threats are around climate change, we need to acknowledge that a big part of it is also just making sure that we're food secure in the state. We're never going to be able to produce all the food that Massachusetts residents eat. We don't have enough of a land base, and the climate is particularly challenging. But we need to be able to produce more. We need to understand how we can adapt to the changing climate and produce more, because the next disaster or crisis is not necessarily going to be a pandemic. It may be wildfires, it may be energy grid interruptions or things like that. And we may lose Southern California crops for multiple years at a time, and we're going to need to be more self-reliant. And so Massachusetts farms, Massachusetts fishers need to be part of that equation around food security. State also developed a clean energy and climate plan for 2050. Again, you'll hear me say this repeatedly, not enough attention to agriculture. Farmers were not at the table as much as they should have been. There was a little bit of talk about agrivoltaics. Agrivoltaics is a up and coming, still being studied field or opportunity where farmland can be put to dual use, where solar panels can be erected on poles in ways that the sun can still reach the ground and can allow either for crop growth or forage growth for animals to graze on. As I said, it's still being studied. The jury's still out. There are a few installations around the state, and there's still questions. There's some crops that grow well under them, and there's many crops that don't grow well under them. And there's obviously, because it's so new, there's long-term implications that we just don't know about yet. But the plan talks about that and talks about putting some resources into studying that. It does talk about incentivizing low tillage and no tillage, and cover crops and better nutrient management, all things that help keep the soil healthy. It doesn't offer any incentives for emission reductions for farms. The state has been far and away one of the best in the country around reducing emissions from cars and incentivizing electric vehicles. Nothing about electric tractors, nothing about electric farm equipment. There is a bill that's been filed this session that would nibble around the edges of that a little bit. But again, a big missed opportunity there. And I talked about the difference about where you cite solar on productive versus non-productive land. It does not prohibit solar siting on productive land. And it's disappointing. We need we need policy that says we can't take farmland, food producing farmland out of production. They are very careful to protect forest. There's stuff in the plan about saying we're not going to cut down any trees in order to produce more solar, but doesn't make the same commitment about we're not going to reduce our productive capacity of food for solar. So those are the current plans that are in play. Obviously, the devil's in the details, and how implementation happens is really what matters. It's a very long-range plan, and the science is going to change, and we're going to learn more, and there's going to be new opportunities for tweaking it. And so that's something that farmers and organizations like mine and Jennifer's are paying close attention to make sure that where farmers have been left out of the discussion so far, that they are more and they're included more in the future. Jen touched on these a little bit, but I'll dig in a little more deeply. These are the existing grant programs that the state has to support farmers. The first one, AEP, is really, it focuses on practices that reduce or prevent negative impacts to natural resources from farming. And so it helps farmers with efficient use of water or practices that help improve air quality. ACRE is the biggest one. The second one, agricultural climate resiliency and efficiencies. This one funds materials and labor for implementation of practices that address the agricultural sector's vulnerability to climate change. So where farmers are struggling with all those things that I talked about at the top, helps farmers figure out how to adapt. And then the Ag Energy Program is to help farmers implement renewable energy. I mentioned hoop houses and greenhouses. It's a great way to extend the season. It's a great way to deal with to create a microclimate and to deal with the fact that the climate is so unpredictable, and to be able to have some more consistency in growing food. But those practices are extremely energy intensive and either end up using a lot of electricity or a lot of other kinds of fuel. And so ultimately, this program helps farmers adapt and employ renewable energy practices on their farms. So those are three really good grant programs, and I will say they're all extremely oversubscribed. well over twice as much money is requested from them each year as is allotted to them. And this is money that is exclusively at the governor's purview. It's money that's available from the environmental bond bill, which is very, very underspent. And the governor each year puts out a capital budget and dedicates resources to all of these kinds of programs. A previous governor, sort of level funded these things each year, and we're hoping that our new governor pays more attention and is willing to increase the amount of money made available through these programs. And then the Coordinated Soil Health Program is a new program that's much more about providing technical assistance. It's not a grant program. It's run by American Farmland Trust and NOFA, Massachusetts, really helping farmers through peer-to-peer networking and technical assistance understand how to work with their soil, because it's the most valuable resource they have. So I'll close with some sort of thoughts on what kind of policy overall is needed. At the top is no net loss of farmland. Massachusetts 100 years ago was 80% farmland, and now it's about 15. And we've lost farmland primarily to forest, actually, to reforestation. And that's because farmers have struggled so much to stay sustainable. And when farms get abandoned, they grow back up into forest. The state understandably prioritizes keeping forests intact. So we don't often see forest land being turned back into tillable acreage, but we need to stop the loss. The most recent numbers show farmland in Massachusetts being lost at a rate of about 6 acres per day. And that's land that doesn't ever come back. You often hear about farms being lost to development. It's pretty rare that you hear about a Walmart being torn down to turn into a farm field. And so we need policy that actually stops the loss of farmland. There is precedent for this. If folks know about the Wetlands Protection Act, you can't do construction in Massachusetts. You can't do things that disturb wetlands, because we have prioritized wetlands and recognizing the value of them to climate change and to natural resources and for cultural reasons as well. And so we've said that's a priority. If anyone is going to do a development project, they have to go through a process, indicate if they're going to be disturbing any wetlands. And if they are, they've got to figure out how they're going to mitigate that, or they're going to pay it into a mitigation fund, or they can't disturb the wetland. Why can't we do that with farmland as well? We need to increase investment in protection of farmland. Massachusetts had the first in the nation farmland protection program. It's called the Agricultural Preservation Restriction Program, where the state actually buys restrictions, easements on farmland so that it can never be developed and must remain in agricultural production in perpetuity. But we've fallen behind on actually spending, again, the money that's available to that program. There's lots of opportunities to be putting more resources into that program and permanently protecting more land. The idea of compensating farmers for ecosystem eco-services is a conversation that's been being had in other parts of the country as well. Vermont recently passed a law and developed a program around this. If farmers are planting cover crops, or if farmers are employing renewable energy projects, anything that they're doing that's helping the greater good, is threatening their long-term sustainability or viability, because, as we talked about, farmers don't make a lot of money in Massachusetts. They need to be supported in doing that. They're doing something for the common, and they need support from all of us in doing that. I mentioned UMass Extension. We did get a little bit of new money from them this past year, but they still need more. I talked about solar. We need to allow farmers to benefit from solar, but not have them fighting off the very tempting offers from the solar developers who come knocking on their door and say they want to take a 30-acre field of prime soil and turn it into a solar array. I mentioned the electric equipment as well, and the bill that's in play this session, incentivizing electric equipment for farmers in the same way that we do it for cars or for buses or for trucks, is another really important step. And then finally, the Food Security Infrastructure Grant Program, which started up during the pandemic, that helps not just farms, but food enterprises, from schools to food pantries to businesses, all need support, again, in remaining sustainable and making sure that we all get fed. The program has been incredibly successful, and again, incredibly oversubscribed. We're very excited to see Governor Healy include money for it in her budget for the first time. Prior to this, it's come from bond money, but this would be the first step towards making it an actual permanent program. We're holding our breath till the House budget comes out tomorrow and hoping that they're going to include money in there as well. And that would be another really big step. The language in the most recent round of it did have some carve outs, certain amounts of money that were specifically targeted towards energy projects and climate projects to help farms with these issues. So those are the issues around money and around policy that we're looking at that will help farmers not just to mitigate the impacts of climate change on their operations, but to be the kind of partners that they really want to be and that they really can be in helping the state meet its climate goals. And I will wrap up there, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you all for your presentations. There's just so much to know, and I appreciate you guys all sharing some of what you deal with in and day out. As I mentioned at the top, part of our mission is to talk with folks about reducing their carbon footprint. And I was wondering if you could translate a little bit of how some of what you've discussed helps to reduce carbon emissions and what kinds of things you see helping to do that. And I'll just, you can jump in as the question inspires you.
I mean, I feel like there are many things that get tossed around that people can do. Obviously, just, you know, the canned, oh, buy local and reduce the food that you throw away. But I think those are real tangible actions that people can do in their daily lives, right? Like, you know, drive around less, carpool, do whatever, but like really pay attention, grow your own food if you have the capacity and, you know, access to land or a pot and soil. Like, try producing some of your own and support others that do it, and don't waste food. I mean, a third of all of our food is wasted. It's like, think of all the resources that go into producing it, and, you know, think of how much we've hopefully put back in the soil or not, or we're putting it in landfills. So I don't know.
I would just add too, I know someone had a comment about a question about this, but eating plant-based food does reduce emissions compared to eating animal products, right? So certainly reducing beef in your diet, and then to a lesser extent pork, and certainly animal flesh from cows is a really big carbon footprint. So reducing that, I mean, I think if we're thinking about a sustainable world that really solves climate change, it will mean that people will eat less red meat than the typical New Englander does today. And does that mean some people still eat some red meat? Great, but people can't have it breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And there are ways, you know, there's lots of innovation right now in terms of replacements and alternatives, but that's going to be one of the big steps.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll just say that, you know, the climate impact of your food is one part of the equation, and it needs to be considered. And I'll say that you want to do the right thing. What the answer is you got to be spending more money for your food. Mm-hmm. Americans spend less on food right now than any country in the world in history as a percent of disposable income. And we have cheapened food that way because of exploitation of labor and exploitation of the environment. And that's not just about carbon. It's also about all kinds of issues around chemicals and you know, there's all kinds of math you can do about the carbon footprint of any morsel of food. But the reality is, you know, people complain or talk about, you know, why is local food more expensive? The question is, why is the other food so cheap? Because, as I said, Massachusetts farmers, even with charging a premium, even with charging a fair price that helps them survive in a state that has the most expensive land in the country and higher labor costs and higher energy costs and other input costs, and they're still barely getting by because they have to compete with these super cheap prices that are on the supermarket shelves because of all those external costs that we're not bearing, we're not addressing. We're just turning a blind eye to at this point. So it's not just looking at your carbon impact of a portion of food. It's looking overall at how the food was produced and where it came from, and the price tells you something about the values of the production chain that went into that item.
One of the questions points to that, which is of the volunteer farmers market manager looking for some strong sound bites on why residents should pay that premium and pay and shop locally grown food instead of market basket or whatever. And are there additional points you would give this manager as well?
We heard a lot of good points in the presentations for why this is a good idea. I would say it's not always a shoe-in from a climate perspective, though, because if you're buying local meat, it's not better for climate change specifically than buying, dried beans at Market Basket. Like, dried beans at Market Basket are probably better for climate change. They're maybe not better for lots of other things that we value in this world, but the climate argument doesn't automatically mean only locally produced food should be eaten. I think it's a holistic question about that we want to generate a resilient food system locally, but that's part of a resilient society. It's part of a society that values our land and our our ability to produce food here that is appropriate and can feed people.
And when you brought it out to think about, the complexity of these issues, one of the things I kept hearing about, again and again in presentations is land. And so one of the questions was directed to you, Jennifer. Any of you can answer. Approximately how many acres of farmland are needed to feed one American today? And can that be reduced?
I don't know what the soundbite answer to that is, because it really depends on your diet. Again, what are you eating? Are you eating protein? Are you eating grains? Are you eating, vegetables, mostly fruit? I mean, it really depends on the composition of your diet to say the X number of acres will give you a full balanced diet. But I do think that, I liked a lot of Winton's point, like, we shouldn't be turning our farmland, the little precious farmland that we have left, we can't lose more of it. And I think, part of the other challenges, other countries are buying up arable land around the world at alarming rates. I mean, China owns most of Africa now. They're buying more land in South America. It's like we're going to be having wars over arable land and fresh water sooner than we realize, because as those finite resources are continuing to be affected, where are we going to turn? If we're not prioritizing food growing spaces that are viable and we're not willing to cut down forests to create more of it, then why are we not protecting it at a higher rate? I also learned a few years ago that, other companies now are trying to figure out how to farm on oceans. Like, there are now dairy farms floating in oceans on barges because we've run out of enough land to raise dairy cows. Roche, the La Roche, the folks that grow hazelnuts. MIT was doing a research project on trying to figure out how to grow hazelnut trees on barges in the ocean. So this is a growing concern. And I think if we don't protect more farmland, it's not going to matter how many acres can feed a family. It's like, do we have enough arable land to feed all of us? Sorry, that was a tangent, but.
Yeah, no, it's related to one of the questions that was asked, is pointing out, clearly New England, we see the remnants from the stone walls of where the farmland used to be that is now forests. And I mean, do you just see it as politically not viable? Is it, are there reasons to sustain the forests, or is it just the politics of not wanting to cut down forests, in your opinion?
There is an amazing YouTube channel that I was watching recently. I wonder if we could share it, that talks about the forests of New England. And this guy had a statistic that basically said, if you piled up all the stone in the stone walls that are going throughout our forests, right, it would be more than all the pyramids of Egypt. And that the length of the stone walls, if you put them all next to each other, would be halfway to the moon and would circle the equator several times. And so his point was something like, these would be one of the wonders of the world. if we talked about them more. All this to say, I think that I think that there are a lot of questions about, sometimes it's hard to farm on glacial soil, right? So I don't know if the answer is that we want to cut down all the trees in New England and try to make this all into farmland, but I think there's maybe an appropriate balance that that could include a thoughtful plan for food production here. And I don't know, I don't have such a plan, but I bet Winton does. Go ahead. I just was interested to share that the point about the stone wall.
Yeah, I mean, this is all about balance, right? Because if you say that climate change is the priority to the exclusion of everything else, then we should let all of our farm fields grow back up into forests, because the number one thing to address climate change is trees. But we want to eat too, and we want to have a food economy too. And so, what's gotten us into these messes in the first place is this single-minded thinking of just, for a generation or two, we prioritize one thing, and then for the next generation or two, we prioritize something else. We have not had food shortages that we've had to deal with here. And so we haven't prioritized food security in a very real way. We've gotten complacent and gotten, well, it's more efficient to grow the food out in the square states and ship it here. So that's what we're going to do. And it seems to be working. There was some blips early in the pandemic. And even the same thing with climate change. We joke and say, oh, isn't it great? It's 60 degrees in January. But the reality is we haven't really felt the impacts of it, because we've gotten, we've built up buffers against it to ourselves. And so we're not addressing it like it's a real thing. Well, both of these things are very real things, and we need to be able to plan for both of them at the same time. But the reality is, and the advocacy community is not great at this either, is it can't be a zero-sum game, and we got to figure out how we're gonna eat and breathe at the same time.
So I think related to that is a question: how will climate change affect the relative competitiveness of farms in New England? For example, the cost of production here relative to costs in other regions. So if we do want to build up a food system, more of our food system here, how does that balance to perhaps some lower costs or perceived lower costs in other places?
Great question. There must have been a study that answered this. I don't know it. And if I can't quote it, I would have some hypotheses, but I don't know if someone's fully answered it.
It's looking at different crops, and it's something, again, I sound angrier than I usually am tonight. Sorry. But I get it. We're not going to give up our avocados and our coffee and chocolate and all of that stuff. There's some stuff we don't grow here, and we're going to need to continue to rely on elsewhere. But the reality is, what we're good at growing here and what grows well here is what we should focus on. The cranberry industry grew here not because someone came here and just really loved cranberries. This was the right climate for it. This was the right place for it. Same thing with fruit trees. And so we need to be paying attention as the climate changes, and it's going to change what we can grow successfully, and it's going to eliminate some things. The other thing I'll say is that paying attention to the resources that we have means figuring out the entire food chain for them, because Massachusetts is the second biggest seafood state in the country as far as the amount of seafood that we land. And all of it gets shipped elsewhere. Even if we're going to eat it here in Massachusetts, it gets shipped out of state to be processed somewhere else before it comes back here. And so, everyone was panicking in Massachusetts early in the pandemic. Again, there's no protein, there's no meat. We had more than enough fish to take care of everybody's needs, but everybody wants to eat red meat, like Erin said. We need to look at what we actually have the capacity to grow and what we do well, and take a real hard look at our diets and consider how it is that we all need to adapt as individuals.
There are a lot of good questions here, and you're talking about sort of things that can, be grown and focused on in this region. But somebody asked, is perennial wheat a crop in New England? And then sort of related to, somebody else wanted some clarification about what no-till was. which I think that those could be somewhat related, and wonder if you could address what are some of those new farming practices that are or different crops that we might be able to see a shift in impact on through ag.
I would just say, in our beginning farmer community, there are a lot of gurus out there that are really promoting a lot of no-till, minimal till agriculture and vegetable production with, a lot of hand scale labor, tarping, covering soils to prevent weeds. I mean, that's the biggest challenge, I think, of not disturbing the soil if you want to grow vegetables. I mean, if you're going to grow pasture, forage, everybody used to say when I first moved here 20 years ago, we grow a lot of great grass in Massachusetts, and we had a strong dairy economy because we grow lots of forage and all of that. We do a lot of haying for horses and other things. But if we're going to grow vegetables or other crops that need to be cultivated, it is challenging to do that in an entirely no-till environment without a lot of extra labor, because we have, like Winton said, a lot of pest and weed pressure, and that takes, you have to be able to germinate little seeds and let the plants get the nutrients that they need in the soil without competing with other plants in the soil. So if we are going to move, there are new no-till seed drills, and there have been a lot of trials that UMass have done over the years trying to do a better job of demonstrating no-till vegetable production. But I don't think it's not easy for everyone to do it well. And yeah, it's a challenge. So, I mean, not disturbing the soil is great to sequester carbon, but you've got to disturb the soil to get crops in the ground and harvest them in an effective way, or we're going to see, yield loss, which is like, then you just need that much more land to grow more food if you're not going to produce as much of it on the same amount of land. So it's really about optimizing the growing conditions and trying to figure out how to balance all of that. With minimally disturbing the soil, I guess.
I just want to add a comment here. One of the reasons I was personally interested in this is my dad. I grew up with a dad. My grandparents were farmers, and my dad was the first to not be a farmer, and because he couldn't afford the land to go another generation. And so instead, he went into agricultural finance. And I think that because I had this, that just happened to be my childhood, I was aware of that. But I think that, listening to you all talk, it strikes me that so often, I think that people that are walking to the grocery store are thinking about the economics of their own family budget. And, understandably, especially, with inflation, it's tough. But I think that one of the things that maybe we don't always think about is the business side of agriculture, when you're talking about yields and the impact then that it has, if being that on the economy of farming and how that impacts. So I just really want to just thank you for being here tonight and talking about this. And so if you had an ability to sit down with Governor Healy and ask for 3 top goals to incentivize some changes, and I know you've thrown a lot out there already, but what would be on your list, high on your list, to incentivize some of the changes to strengthen the food system? You want the whole
I think Winton mentioned a lot of them. I mean, I would love to, transition a lot of state-owned land to beginning farmers and have the infrastructure investment to make it compatible with the types of businesses that they want to do. I would definitely put a moratorium on developing any future farmland. I think we do need to protect it and make it affordable for people. And we need a lot more support for research and education. That would fund the work that we do. It would fund more people to help farmers figure out what to do. I mean, if farming could be economically viable in an easier way, we would have more people signing up to do it, and we would be protecting land because more people would want the opportunity to grow food and feed the community. It's a tough sell right now to work super hard and still have to have an off-farm job and make less than it costs you to produce, but people still do it because they love it. They love taking care of the land. They love feeding their community. They love contributing to this, to the fact that we all eat, and people want to manage the resources and do this work, but societally, we're not making it an easy career choice. And I think the younger generation are excited to think about these careers if they have a pathway to figure out how to get access to land and the resources and infrastructure. And if people valued local food more, I think we would start to see that shift.
I would add just what I said earlier about farmland protection. I think that's one of the first things that I would bring up. But the other thing, because this question was more about the food system, and earlier I was focused on climate change, but is bringing back what used to be called home economics in the classroom. We all used to have to know where food came from, how to prepare it, and that went away at the same time that there started to be fast food joints on every corner, and frozen TV dinners started showing up in the grocery stores. Maybe it's a coincidence, but maybe it's related. And we need to be starting when kids are young with eating habits and with an understanding of how the food system actually works, because that's what's going to drive the kinds of changes that we need. And it's not just about, saying simply eat local or eat organic or eat less meat. It's understanding all of the economic and cultural and environmental implications of every forkful, and just turning people into real thoughtful eaters. And we know that what kids learn is what kids want to eat is what drives what the parents buy, and so and feed their families. So if we can start working on kids, and it's going to have a lasting impact and a deep impact.
And conveniently, there's a new food literacy bill in the legislature, right, Winton?
Oh, good point, Jennifer. Yes, one of the collaborative campaigns is the campaign for food literacy, and there is a budget ask that's going to be coming up tomorrow again in the House, and also a bill that would start to develop some standards so that these kinds of things can be more easily taught in K through 12 classrooms.
That's great. And this is going to be our last question. And from Jeff Barsnell, who often is in this role as a moderator asking questions, so he has to get a question in. If we don't want solar to compete with good farmland here in New England, should we instead prioritize wind power and maritime wind farms off our coast? Do you think it's possible to both decarbonize our electric grid and keep our farmland?
It is. We have a lot of in Massachusetts, parking lots. Great place for solar panels, and there's actually a bill this session that would incentivize putting solar panels up over parking lots. The added bonus, you get to walk from your car to the store and you don't get wet. They don't have to plow in the winter because the snow stays up on the panels. There's lots of land that would make for great solar infrastructure in the state still, and it doesn't have to come from farmland. Farmland just looks appealing because it tends to be flat, close to the road, already cleared, but there's plenty of room for more than enough solar power to meet the state's goals on the built environment. And obviously, yes, there's lots of opportunities for wind as well. I know that's a third rail because of concerns about offshore wind, but there's a lot of opportunities there too.
Well, thank you for helping us think so much more about the impact of our food system on climate and how they interact, and also bringing up, the dynamics around the economics and the workers, also the impact on that. And to all of those watching, a reminder that our next program is Tuesday, May 2nd, with the Reverend Mariama White Hammond, who currently serves as the Chief of Environment, Energy, and Open Space for the City of Boston. This is going to be an opportunity for us to ask her what many of us who are watching are in the suburbs. What's the relationship between the suburbs and the city in addressing issues of environmental justice? The recording for tonight will be up on our YouTube page and our website by tomorrow. And so if you want to go back to those great slides, get some more information, get contact information for our panelists to follow up with some more of these policy suggestions and how we can make a difference, please do so. And thank you again, Winton, Aaron, and Jennifer, for being with us tonight. Have a good night.
Can I just put in a quick plug that tomorrow is Ag Day at the State House, and Winton and I will be there. So if you want to come talk to your local legislators and whatnot about all these issues, show up at the State House tomorrow. It'll be an interesting time. You'll learn even more.
Thank you very much. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.